On my 18th birthday, my MOM sat me down and calmly said, "We never saved a penny for your college. We didn't think you'd ever amount to much." Years later, she showed up at my university to celebrate my brother, only to find me on stage telling the entire room exactly what she did. I turned 18 on a quiet Wednesday evening in our suburban neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. There was nothing special about the day. No balloons, no decorations, no cake sitting on the kitchen counter waiting for candles. If someone had walked into our house that evening, they probably would not have guessed it was my birthday at all. Dinner was already on the table when I got home from school, and it looked exactly like any other night. My mom, Diane, had made baked chicken with rice and green beans. My dad, Robert, was already sitting at the table scrolling through something on his phone. My younger brother, Tyler, was talking about a soccer game he had coming up that weekend. Nobody said anything about my birthday except a quick happy birthday from my mom that sounded more like she was checking something off a list. I remember sitting there quietly, moving the food around my plate more than actually eating it. Something about the atmosphere felt strange, like the air in the room was heavier than usual. My parents kept exchanging these quick glances when they thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was noticeable enough that I couldn't ignore it. Every time my dad looked at my mom, she would slightly nod or press her lips together like they were silently agreeing on something. I tried to focus on Tyler talking about how his coach thought he might make the varsity team next year, but I could feel that weird tension crawling across the table. The whole dinner lasted maybe 20 minutes, and most of that time was just Tyler talking about himself, while my parents listened with polite interest. No one asked me about school, my plans, or even how turning 18 felt. When we finished eating, my mom started collecting the plates while my dad wiped his hands on a napkin and leaned back in his chair. Then he looked directly at me and said they wanted me to sit in the living room for a serious conversation. The way he said it immediately made my stomach tighten. The phrase serious conversation, coming from my parents, never meant anything good. Still, I followed them into the living room without saying anything. Tyler stayed in the kitchen, completely uninterested in whatever was about to happen. I sat down on the couch while my parents took the chairs across from me. For a moment, no one spoke. My mom kept folding and unfolding her hands in her lap, and my dad stared at the carpet like he was organizing his thoughts. I honestly thought they were about to give me some emotional speech about adulthood. Maybe something about responsibility or independence. It was my 18th birthday, after all. Part of me even expected something encouraging, like they were proud of me for growing up. Instead, my dad cleared his throat and started speaking in a calm, almost businesslike tone. He said they had been meaning to talk to me about college and my future for a while. He explained that now that I was 18, it was time for me to understand the reality of things. At first, I just nodded along, waiting for the point he was building toward. Then, he said something that made the room feel colder. He told me that they had never saved any money for my college. At first, I thought I had misheard him. It sounded so blunt and casual that my brain struggled to process it. I knew college was expensive, and I never assumed my parents had some massive fund waiting for me. But hearing that they had saved absolutely nothing was still shocking. My mom quickly added that they didn't want to take it the wrong way. She said they just never really believed college would be something I pursued seriously. She said it gently, like she thought softening the words would somehow make them easier to accept. My dad didn't bother softening anything. He leaned forward slightly and said they had always assumed I probably wouldn't accomplish much academically. He explained it the same way someone might explain why they didn't invest in a risky stock. In his mind, it had simply been the logical decision. For a few seconds, I couldn't even react. It felt like someone had punched me directly in the chest. I had always suspected that my parents didn't expect much from me, but hearing them say out loud like that was completely different. My thoughts immediately jumped to Tyler. My younger brother had always been the golden child in our house. Tyler was naturally athletic, outgoing, and confident in a way that adults seem to love. Coaches praised him. Teachers talked about his leadership potential. Family members constantly bragged about his accomplishments during holidays. I was the opposite. I was quiet, average at sports, and the kind of student who had to work hard just to stay above AB average. I wasn't failing, but I wasn't exceptional either. Growing up, it always felt like my parents were waiting for me to disappoint them. Sitting there in the living room that night, I realized that my quiet suspicion had actually been the truth the entire time. They had already decided who the promising child was. And it wasn't me. As I sat there listening to my parents calmly explain why they had never saved a single dollar for my future, a long series of memories started replaying in my head. Moments that I had spent years trying to ignore or explain away. Growing up in our house had always felt uneven, but for most of my childhood, I convinced myself that I was probably imagining it. Tyler was younger than me by 2 years, but somehow everything in our family seemed to orbit around him like he was the center of gravity. When he was little, my parents enrolled him in private soccer camps and training programs that cost more money than I even understood at the time. I remember sitting in the stands during his practices while my mom proudly watched him run across the field in brand new gear that seemed to be replaced every season. His cleats were always the newest model, his uniforms perfectly fitted, and his coaches constantly praised how much potential he had. Meanwhile, my own interests were treated more like temporary hobbies that didn't deserve much investment. When I wanted to try basketball in middle school, my dad bought me the cheapest pair of shoes he could find at a discount store and told me not to expect anything fancy until I proved I was serious about it. I practiced for months and made the team, but by the next season Tyler had another expensive soccer camp scheduled, and most of my games went unnoticed because my parents were busy driving the tournaments in other cities. Birthdays were probably the clearest example of how different things were between us. Tyler's birthdays were always loud, crowded, and carefully planned weeks in advance. My parents rented places like bowling alleys or trampoline parks, ordered huge custom cakes, and invited what felt like half the neighborhood. I remember watching Tyler tear open stacks of presents while everyone laughed and took pictures. Expensive headphones, gaming consoles, brand-name clothes, sports equipment, things that made his friends stare in amazement. My birthdays were quieter. Sometimes it was just dinner at home and a small cake from the grocery store. My presents were usually simple things like a hoodie, a book, or a $20 gift card. My parents would smile and say something encouraging about how proud they were that I was responsible and didn't need flashy things. At the time, I tried to accept that explanation because part of me wanted to believe there was some larger plan behind the scenes. The biggest moment that stayed burned into my memory happened when Tyler turned 16. That afternoon, my parents told us to come outside because they had a surprise for him. Sitting in the driveway was a brand new car with a giant red bow on the hood, like something straight out of a commercial. Tyler stood there completely stunned, while my mom filmed the entire reaction on her phone. My dad gave a short speech about how proud they were of Tyler's hard work and how they wanted to support his future. Later that same evening, during dinner, they also announced that they had started a college fund for him that already had $40,000 saved in it. They talked about it openly at the table, explaining how important education was and how they wanted Tyler to have every opportunity possible when the time came. I remember sitting there quietly, forcing myself to smile and congratulate him while something uncomfortable twisted in my chest. At that point, I was already almost 18, which meant college decisions were right around the corner for me too. I never asked my parents if they had done something similar for me because I convinced myself they probably had something prepared but just hadn't mentioned it yet. I told myself maybe they were waiting for the right moment or planning some kind of surprise. That illusion completely shattered during the conversation in the living room on my 18th birthday. After my parents finished explaining their reasoning, the room fell into an awkward silence that felt heavier than anything they had actually said. I could feel their eyes watching me, probably expecting some kind of emotional reaction, but I didn't give them one. I simply nodded slowly like I understood what they were saying. Inside my chest, everything felt hollow. Eventually, the conversation ended with my dad telling me that if I wanted to go to college, I would need to figure out loans, scholarships, or some other way to pay for it myself. He spoke about it like he was giving practical advice rather than explaining why they had never even tried to prepare for my future. I stood up, said goodnight in a quiet voice, and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. The house was silent by then. Tyler was probably in his room playing video games or texting friends, completely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. I closed my bedroom door and sat down on the edge of my bed for a while without turning on the lights. Eventually, I lay back and stared up at the ceiling. The same white ceiling I looked at thousands of times growing up suddenly felt different, like the room itself was reminding me how long I had lived under the assumptions of people who didn't expect anything from me. Hours passed while I replayed the conversation in my head along with every moment from my childhood that suddenly made more sense. I didn't go back into the living room to argue with them. I didn't knock on their door to demand explanations or fairness. I didn't even cry. Instead, something quieter happened inside my mind. Lying there in the dark, I made a decision that I never said out loud to anyone in that house. If my own parents had already decided what I was capable of, then there was no point wasting energy trying to convince them otherwise. From that moment forward, whatever happened in my life would happen because I forced it to happen myself. About 6 months after that conversation in the living room, I packed everything I owned into the back seat of my old secondhand sedan and drove to Lakeview State University. Getting accepted there hadn't been easy, without any financial help waiting for me. The only reason I was even able to enroll was because I had spent months filling out scholarship applications and writing essays late at night after finishing school assignments. Eventually, I managed to secure a partial academic scholarship. It wasn't nearly enough to cover everything, but it was just enough to open the door. The rest of the cost became my responsibility the moment I stepped onto campus. The reality of surviving college without support hit me immediately. While other freshmen were decorating dorm rooms and exploring campus events during orientation week, I was signing paperwork for 2 different part-time jobs and calculating exactly how many hours I would need to work just to keep myself afloat. I couldn't afford to live in the dorms, so I rented a tiny off-campus apartment that barely deserved to be called an apartment. It was a narrow studio above an old laundromat with cracked linoleum floors and a window that rattled every time a truck drove past a building. The rent was cheap compared to everything else in the area, but even that small amount felt like a mountain when I looked at my bank balance. My first job was at a roadside diner about 10 minutes from campus. It stayed open all night, mostly serving truck drivers, late-night travelers, and exhausted students who needed greasy food after studying. My shift usually started around 10 at night and ended close to 3 in the morning. I spent those hours refilling coffee mugs, wiping down counters, and carrying plates of food that smelled amazing even when I knew I couldn't afford to order anything myself. The fluorescent lights inside that diner never changed, which made the long nights blur together until it felt like time had stopped moving. A few hours after finishing there, I would drag myself back to campus for my second job. The campus bookstore needed someone to restock shelves early in the morning before students flooded in for classes. My shift there started at 6. Most mornings I walked in with barely any sleep, my eyes burning while I unpacked boxes of textbooks and supplies. I learned quickly how to function while completely exhausted, moving automatically through tasks while my brain struggled to stay focused. Between those 2 jobs and my class schedule, my life turned into a constant cycle of rushing from one place to another while trying not to collapse from fatigue. There were weeks where I slept only a few hours each night. Sometimes I would fall asleep at my desk while studying, only to wake up with my notes stuck to my face. Other times I would lie down for what was supposed to be a quick nap and wake up in panic because I had accidentally slept through half the afternoon. Money was always the biggest source of stress. After paying rent and utilities, there were days when my budget for food barely existed. I learned how to stretch a few dollars across several meals by buying cheap ramen noodles and store-brand peanut butter. There were also days when I simply skipped meals altogether because I needed to save every possible dollar. Hunger became something normal, a dull sensation that followed me through lectures and study sessions. Despite all that, I forced myself to keep my grades high. The scholarship I had earned required me to maintain a strong academic record, and losing it wasn't an option, because that would mean losing the only support I had. I studied whenever I could find a quiet moment, sometimes reading textbooks during slow hours at the diner, or reviewing notes while sitting on the floor of the bookstore stockroom. My life became entirely focused on survival and progress, moving forward inch by inch even when everything felt overwhelming. While all of this was happening, my phone would occasionally light up with messages from my parents. Most of them had the same passive-aggressive tone that made my stomach tighten every time I read them. My mom would write things like she hoped I wasn't forgetting about my family just because I was busy at college. My dad would mention how I hadn't visited home in a while and ask why I seemed so distant lately. None of the messages ever asked how I was actually managing everything or whether I needed help. At the same time, my social media feeds constantly filled with posts from them celebrating Tyler. My mom loved uploading photos of him in his soccer uniform with captions about how proud she was of his talent and dedication. My dad shared videos from Tyler's games along with long comments about how exciting it was to watch him grow into such an impressive young man. Friends and relatives would flood the posts with likes and supportive messages, congratulating my parents on raising such a talented kid. Whenever I saw those posts, I couldn't help noticing how the language always framed Tyler's achievements as victories for the whole family. They wrote about his success like it was proof that everything they had invested in him was paying off. Meanwhile, the reality of my life rarely appeared anywhere in those conversations. There were no posts about the nights I spent working until dawn or the mornings I forced myself through lectures while fighting exhaustion. My parents never talked publicly about the fact that I was paying for my entire education alone while trying to survive on almost nothing. To them, it seemed like my struggles simply didn't exist. Several months into my first year at Lakeview State, I finally made a decision to visit home for a weekend. It wasn't because I particularly wanted to go back. In fact, part of me had been avoiding it. Between my classes and 2 jobs, it was easy to claim I was too busy to make the drive. But the truth was that I wasn't sure how it would feel to walk back into that house after everything that had happened. Still, my mom had been sending messages about how long it had been since they'd seen me, and eventually I convinced myself that maybe things would feel normal again if I just showed up. The drive back to our suburb outside Columbus felt strangely familiar and distant at the same time. The same streets, the same grocery stores, the same quiet neighborhoods that I had known my entire life were all exactly what it had always been. But I felt like someone visiting rather than someone returning home. When I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there for a moment staring at the house before grabbing my bag from the back seat. Inside, the place looked almost identical to the way I remembered it. The same furniture, the same framed photos on the walls, the same faint smell of cleaning products mixed with whatever my mom had cooked earlier that day. My parents greeted me politely when I walked in, but the warmth I had hoped for never really appeared. It felt more like the kind of greeting you give to a distant relative who stops by unexpectedly. That evening they had a few neighbors and family friends over. Apparently, Tyler had recently been involved in some kind of small photography exhibition through a local youth arts program, and my mom was excited to talk about it. I hadn't even known he had started photography. While everyone gathered in the living room with drinks and snacks, my mom eagerly pulled out her phone and began showing people photos from the event. She stood in the center of the room like a proud host, swiping through picture after picture while explaining how talented Tyler had become behind the camera. People leaned closer to look at the screen, nodding and complimenting the photos while my mom described how impressive the exhibition had been. Tyler stood nearby, smiling modestly, while my dad chimed in with additional details about how much potential he had in creative fields. I was sitting on the edge of the couch only a few feet away during the entire conversation, but it felt like I was invisible. No one asked me about school. No one asked how college was going or how I had been managing everything. At one point, someone casually asked my mom how both of her sons were doing, and she immediately launched into another story about Tyler's photography without even glancing in my direction. The moment lingered in my mind longer than I expected. Over the next day or two, another pattern started to appear. My parents began asking me for small favors related to Tyler. At first, it sounded harmless. My mom mentioned that Tyler was starting to prepare his college applications and thought it would be helpful if I could look over his essays, since I was already in college and probably knew what admissions offices like to see. She said it casually while we were standing in the kitchen, like it was an obvious request. Not long after that, my dad brought up Tyler's laptop during dinner. Apparently, it had stopped working properly, and he mentioned that replacing it might take some time. Then he looked at me and suggested that maybe I could give Tyler my laptop since I probably had access to computers on campus anyway. He said it with the same tone someone might use when suggesting a practical solution to a small inconvenience. I remember sitting there quietly while those words hung in the air. The laptop I owned wasn't anything fancy. It was an older model that I had bought used with money from my diner job. I depended on it for nearly every assignment and research paper I had to complete. Without it, keeping up with my coursework would have been almost impossible. Yet the way my dad framed the suggestion made it sound like my needs were automatically secondary. I didn't argue or react strongly in that moment. I just gave a vague response and changed the subject. But something inside me felt increasingly unsettled as the weekend continued. A few weeks after I returned to campus, things took another turn. I got seriously sick. It started with a fever that made it hard to focus during class and quickly escalated into something that left me barely able to get out of bed. Missing work shifts meant losing money I couldn't afford to lose, but I physically couldn't function. Eventually, I forced myself to go to a small clinic near campus where the doctor confirmed that I had a pretty severe infection and needed time to recover. At some point during those days, I texted my mom to tell her what was going on. I didn't expect much from the message. Part of me just wanted to inform her in case my absence from family conversations raised questions. Several hours passed before she replied. When the notification finally appeared on my phone, the message was short and casual, telling me she hoped I felt better soon and reminded me to drink fluids and rest. A few days later, I received something in the mail. It was a simple greeting card from a pharmacy store with a generic "Get well soon" design on the front. Inside was a brief handwritten message from my mom wishing me a quick recovery, along with $15 folded inside the card. Around the same time, I happened to see another one of my parents' posts online. My dad was excitedly talking about how they were planning to buy Tyler a new professional camera, so he could continue developing his photography skills. The price mentioned in the comments was around $1,200. I stared at that number for a long time. In that moment, something inside my chest shifted in a way that felt permanent. It wasn't anger exactly, and it wasn't sadness either. It was more like a quiet realization settling into place after years of uncertainty. For most of my life, I had believed that even if things felt unfair sometimes, I was still an equal part of the family. But sitting there alone in my small apartment, holding a greeting card with $15 inside while reading about a $1,200 camera being planned for Tyler, I finally understood the role I actually played in their lives. In their eyes, I wasn't the child they invested in or celebrated. I was simply the backup option they expected to exist quietly in the background. A few weeks after I had recovered from being sick, my routine had mostly returned to the exhausting rhythm I had grown used to. My days were still packed with lectures, work shifts, and the constant pressure of making sure I didn't fall behind academically. By that point, I had learned how to move through campus almost automatically, cutting across the same paths between buildings, rarely paying attention to anything except the next place I needed to be. One afternoon, while walking past the Student Union building on my way to the bookstore for my morning stocking shift, I heard someone call my name from across the courtyard. The voice sounded familiar enough that I stopped and turned around. A second later, I saw Tyler walking toward me with his usual confident stride, wearing a hoodie from some sports brand and carrying a backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. For a moment, I just stood there, slightly confused about why he was on campus. Tyler wasn't a student at Lakeview State yet. As far as I knew, he was still finishing his final year of high school back home. When he got closer, he smiled casually and said he was visiting the campus for a tour. Apparently, our parents had brought him into the city, so he could explore a few universities he might apply to next year. He spoke about it in the relaxed tone of someone who expected the future to unfold smoothly in front of him. We ended up sitting at a table outside the Student Union for a while. The conversation at first felt surprisingly normal. Tyler talked about school, soccer, and photography, jumping between topics with the easy confidence that had always come naturally to him. I mostly listened and responded when it made sense, tried to ignore the quiet tension that had always existed between us, even if neither of us openly acknowledged it. At some point, the conversation drifted toward college finances. Tyler mentioned how stressful applications could be, but he didn't sound particularly worried about paying for school. In fact, he seemed almost relaxed about the whole situation. Then he casually mentioned that our parents had been discussing finances with him recently. He said they were figuring out how much additional support they might provide beyond the college fund they had already built for him. The way he said it sounded like an ordinary family discussion. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to say much. After a moment, Tyler glanced at me with a slightly curious expression, like he had suddenly remembered something interesting. He said that our parents had actually talked about helping me financially when I first started college. According to him, there had been conversations about maybe sending me money or covering some expenses to make things easier. Hearing that sentence made my chest tighten instantly. For a split second, I felt a strange flicker of hope, like maybe there had been some misunderstanding in the past. But Tyler kept talking. He explained it in a completely casual way, repeating what our parents had told him almost word for word. They had apparently decided not to help because they believed struggling would motivate me more. They thought that if life became too easy for me, I might become lazy or stop pushing myself. Tyler said it without any cruelty in his voice. To him, it sounded like a practical parenting strategy, something that made sense in theory. But sitting there across from him, hearing those words spoken out loud, felt like someone had quietly confirmed a suspicion that had been forming in the back of my mind for years. My struggles during that entire year suddenly took on a different meaning. The nights working until 3 a.m, the mornings running on barely any sleep, the days when I skipped meals because I couldn't afford groceries, the sickness that left me alone in my apartment trying to recover without help. None of it had been an unfortunate situation that my parents simply didn't know about or couldn't change. They had known, and they had decided it was beneficial. Tyler kept talking for a few more minutes about different colleges he was considering, completely unaware that the conversation had shifted something fundamental inside me. I listened quietly, occasionally nodding while my mind processed what he had just revealed. Eventually, he checked his phone and mentioned that our parents were probably waiting for him near the parking lot. We stood up from the table, and he gave me a quick friendly hug before heading off across the courtyard. I watched him walk away until he disappeared behind a row of campus buildings. For a long time after that, I remained standing there alone. The campus around me was busy like always. Students walked past carrying backpacks and coffee cups, conversations blending into the background noise of a normal afternoon. Everything around me continued moving forward exactly as it always had, but inside my head something had quietly settled into place. For years, I had wondered if the distance between me and my parents was just a result of misunderstanding, different expectations, or simple emotional disconnect. Part of me had always believed there might still be some hidden explanation that made things less intentional. Now that uncertainty was gone, they had looked at my situation, understood how difficult it was, and chosen not to intervene because they believed hardship would shape me into something more useful. Later that evening, my phone lit up with a message from my mom asking how my classes were going. My dad sent a separate message a little while after that, reminding me to call home sometime soon, because it had been a while since we talked. I read both messages while sitting at the small desk in my apartment. Then I placed my phone face down and went back to studying. Over the following weeks, the number of calls and texts from my family slowly decreased as my responses became shorter and less frequent. I stopped explaining what was happening in my life. I stopped sharing updates about school, work, or anything else. Instead, I redirected all of my attention toward the one thing that had been keeping me moving forward since the beginning, building a life that didn't depend on them. Not long after that conversation with Tyler on campus, everything inside me finally collapsed under the weight of everything I had been carrying for months. Up until that point, I had been moving forward almost automatically, forcing myself through exhaustion and stress because I believed there was no other option. But hearing the truth about my parents' decision removed the last piece of motivation that had been quietly holding me together. For several days, I felt like the ground beneath my life had shifted in a way I didn't know how to stabilize. It started with small cracks in the routine I had built so carefully. One morning, I missed a lecture because I simply couldn't force myself out of bed. I told myself it was just because I was tired, but the same thing happened the next day. My alarm rang, and I stared at the ceiling while the sound echoed through my apartment until I finally turned it off and rolled onto my side again. The usual urgency that pushed me through every day just wasn't there. The situation spiraled quickly after that. I skipped a shift at the diner because I couldn't bring myself to leave the apartment. I ignored messages from my manager asking where I was. At some point, I ended up sitting on the floor next to my bed, leaning against the wall with my knees pulled close to my chest. Hours passed without me noticing. The light outside the window changed from afternoon to evening, while I remained in the same spot, staring at nothing in particular. For 2 days, I barely moved from that floor. The silence inside the apartment felt thick and heavy. Normally, my mind was constantly occupied with schedules, deadlines, and calculations about money. But during those hours, everything slowed down into a kind of numb stillness. I wasn't crying or panicking. I just felt empty, like all the effort I had been putting into surviving had suddenly lost its direction. Eventually, hunger forced me to stand up. My legs felt stiff from sitting so long, and when I walked into the tiny kitchen area, the refrigerator light revealed how little food I actually had left. A half-empty jar of peanut butter, some leftover noodles, and a carton of milk that was probably about to expire. Standing there in the quiet apartment, something inside my mind shifted again, but this time in a different direction. I realized that if I stayed in that state much longer, everything I had fought for would collapse. The scholarship that allowed me to attend Lakeview State required me to maintain certain grades. Missing classes and work would eventually catch up with me. The fragile structure of my life depended on constant movement forward. So I forced myself to sit down at my desk and open my laptop. The first thing I started doing was searching for any form of emergency financial support available through the university. I discovered that there were small programs designed for students facing unexpected financial hardship. Filling out the applications required explaining parts of my situation that I had rarely spoken about openly, but I wrote everything honestly and submitted the forms anyway. At the same time, I began looking for other ways to earn money that didn't completely destroy the little energy I had left. I signed up for an online tutoring platform where students could help others with coursework in subjects they understood well. It started slowly at first, just a few sessions helping younger students with basic assignments. But even small payments felt meaningful when every dollar mattered. I also began organizing my class notes in a more structured way and uploading them to a website where students could purchase study guides. It wasn't something that made large amounts of money overnight, but occasionally I would receive a notification that someone had bought one of the documents. Those small transactions gradually added up. A few weeks later, I managed to secure additional shifts working in the campus computer lab during quieter hours. The job mostly involved monitoring the room and helping students with simple technical issues. Compared to the chaos of the diner, the environment felt almost peaceful. The steady hum of computers and the soft clicking of keyboards created a calm atmosphere where I could also study during slower periods. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, my situation began to stabilize. Then one afternoon, an email arrived that changed everything more significantly than I expected. Earlier in the semester, one of my professors had encouraged students to apply for a research fellowship within the department. At the time, I had submitted an application without thinking too much about it, assuming the chances were small. The email informed me that I had been selected. The fellowship included the opportunity to assist with research in one of the university labs, along with a monthly stipend that would help cover living expenses. When I read the message the first time, I had to go through it again just to make sure I understood correctly. For the first time since arriving at college, the constant pressure around money loosened slightly. With that additional support, I was able to do simple things that previously felt impossible. I went to the grocery store and bought enough food to fill my refrigerator properly. I replaced my old backpack that had started tearing along the seams after months of heavy textbooks. None of the purchases were extravagant, but they felt like small victories. During that period, I also returned to a habit I had abandoned years earlier. I started writing in a journal again. Late at night after finishing work or studying, I would sit at my desk and write down everything that had been happening in my life. The exhaustion, the anger, the determination, the strange sense of independence that had slowly grown inside me. While writing those pages, a realization began to settle quietly in the back of my mind. For most of my life, I had been measuring my worth against the expectations of people who had already decided what I was capable of. I had spent years hoping that one day my parents would see me differently, that they might eventually acknowledge the effort I was putting into building my future. But somewhere during those long months of surviving on my own, something inside me had changed. I was no longer doing any of this for their approval. As the months passed and my situation slowly stabilized, I focused more and more of my time on building a life that revolved around my own goals instead of my family's expectations. My schedule was still busy, but it no longer felt like I was constantly drowning. The research fellowship gave me steady experience in lab and enough financial breathing room to keep my life from collapsing under the same pressure I had before. My tutoring work online continued bringing in small but consistent amounts of money, and my shifts at the campus computer lab became one of the few quiet parts of my day where I could think clearly. During that period, I had very little contact with my family. Messages from my parents still appeared occasionally on my phone, but they were mostly brief check-ins or casual updates about things happening at home. I responded politely when necessary, but the conversations rarely went anywhere meaningful. It felt less like communicating with close relatives and more like maintaining a distant professional connection. Then one afternoon, I received a notification from my university email that caught me off guard. A professor from another department had written to me asking about Tyler. At first, I assumed it must be some kind of mistake, but as I read the message more carefully, the situation became clear. Tyler had recently applied to transfer into Lakeview State University. Apparently, during the application process, he had also applied for a competitive research assistant position connected to a program related to one of his intended fields of study. Without telling me beforehand, he had listed me as a reference. The professor explained that Tyler had mentioned me during the application process and suggested that I could provide insight into his academic strengths and work ethic. The message was polite and straightforward, asking if I would be willing to share my perspective. For a few minutes, I just stared at the screen. Tyler had never contacted me about this. There had been no phone call, no message asking if I was comfortable being used as a reference, not even a quick warning that my name had been included in his application. He had simply assumed that I would support him automatically. As I thought about what to write back, I remembered conversation Tyler and I had shared months earlier during that unexpected meeting on campus. At the time, he had casually admitted that he struggled with certain subjects connected to the program he was now applying for. He had joked about how difficult those classes had been for him in high school and how he usually relied on group projects to get through them. I opened a new message and began typing. The response I sent was calm and completely honest. I explained that Tyler was capable and motivated in areas he enjoyed, but I also mentioned that he had previously expressed difficulty with a specific subject that the research assistant position focused on. I added that the role might require a level of technical understanding that he had not yet fully developed. I didn't insult him. I didn't exaggerate anything. I simply described the situation truthfully. A few days later, the outcome became clear. Tyler's application for the research assistant position had been rejected. It didn't take long for my phone to start ringing. When I answered, Tyler's voice came through the speaker already tense with anger. He accused me immediately of sabotaging him. According to him, the The professor had mentioned concerns about his background in the subject during the rejection email, and Tyler had quickly connected that feedback to the conversation the professor must have had with me. He spoke rapidly, his frustration building with every sentence. He said that family members were supposed to support each other, and that I had deliberately ruined an opportunity that could have helped him get ahead. I listened quietly until he finished. Then I explained something as calmly as I could. I told him that honesty wasn't the same thing as betrayal. If someone asked me about his qualifications for a specific role, the only responsible thing I could do was describe what I actually knew. The silence on the other end of the call lasted several seconds before he muttered something under his breath and hung up. After that conversation, I returned to focusing on the parts of my life that actually mattered to me. One of those projects had started quietly during my tutoring sessions online. Over time, I began noticing a pattern among some of the students I worked with. Many of them came from underfunded schools that lacked consistent academic support resources. They struggled not because they lacked ability, but because they didn't have access to the same guidance that students from more privileged environments often received. That realization led me to begin working on something new. Using the technical resources available through the campus computer lab and the connections I had developed through my research fellowship, I started building a simple online tutoring platform designed specifically for students from schools with limited funding. The idea was to create a network where college volunteers could provide structured tutoring sessions and study materials to students who otherwise might not have access to that kind of help. At first, it was just a small project that I worked on during late-night hours when the lab was quiet. I wrote code, organized lesson materials, and slowly invited other students from my university to participate. Some of them joined simply because they liked the idea of helping others, while others saw it as an opportunity to gain experience working with educational outreach programs. Over time, the project grew larger than I had originally imagined. Word began spreading around campus about the platform, and eventually one of the faculty advisors connected to the fellowship program introduced me to a small funding opportunity for student-led initiatives focused on educational access. I submitted a proposal explaining how the platform could expand its reach to partner with several underfunded schools in the region. A few weeks later, the project received its first official funding. The recognition that followed happened mostly within the university community. Professors mentioned the platform during meetings. Student organizations began promoting volunteer opportunities connected to it. Slowly, the network expanded, connecting more tutors with more students who needed support. Despite all that progress, I made one very deliberate decision. I never told my family about any of it. Near the beginning of the next academic year, the campus atmosphere shifted as thousands of new freshmen arrived for orientation week. Everywhere I walked, there were groups of students dragging suitcases, parents carrying boxes into dorm buildings, and volunteers guiding people through crowded hallways. The university felt louder than usual, filled with the kind of excitement that only existed at the start of the new school year. Around that time, I received an email from the Student Affairs office asking if I would participate in a panel during freshman orientation. The panel was designed to highlight different student experiences and show incoming students how people from various backgrounds had navigated their first year at the university. Because of my research fellowship, academic performance, and the tutoring platform that had started gaining attention on campus, someone in the administration had recommended me as one of the speakers. At first, the invitation felt strange. For most of my life, I had been the person people overlooked, the quiet student sitting in the background while others received praise and recognition. The idea of standing on a stage and talking about my experiences to hundreds of strangers was something I had never imagined. Still, I agreed. The event took place in one of the largest auditoriums on campus. When I arrived that afternoon, the room was already filling with new students and their families. Rows of seats stretched upward toward the back of the hall, and the low murmur of conversations echoed through the space as people settled in. Parents sat beside their children while flipping through orientation pamphlets, occasionally pointing toward the stage where the panel chairs had been arranged. I waited backstage with the other speakers until a coordinator signaled that it was time to begin. When we walked out under the bright auditorium lights, the room fell into a quieter anticipation. I could feel hundreds of eyes facing the stage, but after the past year of constant challenges, public attention felt far less intimidating than it might have before. As the panel discussion progressed, each student spoke about different parts of their experience adjusting to university life. Some talked about managing homesickness or balancing academics with social life. When it was my turn, the moderator introduced me briefly by mentioning my research work and involvement in student initiatives. I stepped closer to the microphone and looked out at the audience. For a moment, my eyes scanned the rows of faces filling the room. Families sat shoulder to shoulder with their children, many of them looking hopeful or nervous about the future that was beginning for them that week. Then something unexpected caught my attention. A few rows back on the right side of the auditorium, I recognized three familiar faces sitting together. My parents were there. Tyler sat between them wearing a university hoodie, probably attending orientation events for newly admitted students. They had likely come to celebrate his acceptance and explore the campus with him. From the distance, I could see the slight confusion on their faces as they realized that the person standing on the stage was me. For a brief second, the room felt completely still. Then I began speaking. I talked about my first year at the university and the challenges that came with arriving without financial support or a safety net. I explained how difficult it had been to balance classes with multiple jobs while trying to survive in a new environment. I described the night spent working until early morning, the exhaustion that followed me through lectures, and the constant pressure of knowing that if I failed academically, there would be nothing to catch me. I spoke calmly, choosing my words carefully while the room remained completely silent. At one point, I explained that growing up, the people closest to me had never believed I would accomplish much academically. I described how those doubts shaped the expectations placed on me and how support for my education had never been considered important. I didn't mention names, and I didn't point toward anyone in the audience. I simply described the experience in honest terms. Then I explained something that mattered more than any of those obstacles. I told them that sometimes a lack of belief from others can become its own form of motivation. When no one expects anything from you, the only direction left is forward. I described how the struggle itself forced me to develop discipline, resilience, and independence that I might never have discovered otherwise. As I spoke those words, the audience listened with a quiet intensity that filled the entire auditorium. When I finished, the room erupted into applause. The sound echoed off the high walls while people throughout the audience stood and clapped. It wasn't the kind of applause given out of simple politeness. It carried a kind of respect that felt almost surreal after everything that had happened during the past year. Later that evening, there was a smaller academic reception for faculty members, student mentors, and some of the orientation speakers. The event took place in a conference hall where large presentation screens displayed slides highlighting various student achievements and programs across the university. I arrived a little later than most people because I had been finishing work in the lab. When I walked into the hall, a slideshow was playing across a wide screen near the front of the room. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it, while greeting a few professors and colleagues. Then one of the slides changed. My name appeared across the screen along with several lines describing my work. Research fellowship participant, scholarship recipient, and co-founder of a nonprofit tutoring platform supporting underfunded schools. Photos from the tutoring initiative and research lab rotated slowly as the presentation continued. Standing across the room near one of the tables were my parents and Tyler. They must have been invited because Tyler was beginning his first year at the university. When their eyes moved from the screen to me, the expressions on their faces were something I had never seen before. They looked stunned. Not angry, not dismissive, but genuinely shocked. For years they had assumed they understood exactly what I was capable of and what my future would look like. Watching those achievements appear on the screen in front of them seemed to break that certainty in an instant. I didn't walk over to confront them. I didn't say anything at all. There was nothing left to explain. By that point, my life had already answered every doubt they once had about me.